In this video, we'll just say a few quick words about kind of the context in which Buddhism emerges as a new religious tradition, according to scholars. So again, we're thinking of roughly 2,500 years ago. Scholars are not in agreement when it comes to the exact year of birth for our Buddha, or the exact year when he attained enlightenment or even died from earth. So we generally are just going to say sometime around the 5th or 4th centuries BCE, so roughly 2,500 years ago. So after our study of Hinduism, you know that Hinduism in northern India was dominant at that time in history. And what's interesting is that at that time in history, we start to see perhaps some tension within India, especially this kind of northern region of India. And a lot of this tension is based on religion. Remember, this is roughly a little bit later than when you see individuals who will remain part of what we will call Hinduism go out into the forest, compose the Aranyakas and the Upanishads in an attempt to discover more truth than what had been taught by the priests, the Brahmins, from the early sections of the Vedas. And what's important for us here is to realize that those composers of the Aranyakas and the Upanishads are not the only individuals within this portion of India that are seeking greater truth. There are other spiritual teachers out there, especially around the Ganges River, around that river basin, that are trying to discover truth, and many of them actually discover a kind of truth that causes them to leave behind the religion of the Brahmins, what we would call early Hinduism. So here we just want to look at some of the differences between early Hinduism, the religion of the Brahmins at that time in history, and some of these spiritual leaders that are working around the Ganges about 2,500 years ago, one of whom will be eventually our Buddha. There will also be Mahavira, who will be seen as kind of the most recent important leader of what will be called Jainism, another Indian religion that is separate from Hinduism. So we have a lot of these spiritual leaders, some of whom we know by name to this day because they had followers who remembered their teachings and preserved them. Others have been forgotten to history because they may not have been able to attract followers. But here are some of the key differences that we will see between early Hinduism and many of these Ganges spiritual leaders. So first, the Ganges spiritual leaders, like the man who would eventually become our Buddha, often focused on asceticism. Right? Asceticism generally is just a term that refers to the denial of worldly pleasures. Right? The idea is that you are denying yourself certain things that are pleasing in the worldly sense in favor of a focus on spirituality. Now, one of the clearest ways that that has shown up, not only here in Ganges spirituality, but in other portions of other religions around the world, is through the practice of celibacy. So the idea is that by denying yourself sexual activity, marriage, etc., denying yourself those worldly pleasures, you are able to seek greater spiritual progress. So the Buddha, Mahavira, and other Ganges spiritual leaders were often teaching a kind of asceticism for those who wanted to seek spiritual truth at the highest level. Right? It doesn't mean that others couldn't have some access to the spiritual journey, but if you really wanted to seek true enlightenment, then asceticism, perhaps marked by celibacy, was a key component of that journey. This was different than the Brahmins, the priests of early Hinduism, who all were married and had children and were engaged in what might be considered more worldly pursuits as part of their spiritual leadership over early Hinduism. Second, the Ganges spiritual leaders were often focused on ahimsa. We actually saw that term when looking at Gandhi toward the end of our discussion of Hinduism. Ahimsa, generally translated as non-violence. This was a central teaching for our Buddha, Mahavira, and other Ganges spiritual leaders around 2,500 years ago. And where this clearly showed a difference with the early Hindus is with the rejection of non-human animal sacrifice. Remember, non-human animal sacrifices were an important part of many of those rituals described in the ritual treatises of the Vedas in order to create or maintain or restore a sense of harmony between us, between our world, and the world of the gods and the goddesses, right? The Buddha and other Ganges spiritual leaders came along and said, no, we must live by an ideal of nonviolence. Causing violence, killing other living beings can never be a positive step on the spiritual journey to enlightenment. So the focus on nonviolence becomes a key difference between the Ganges spiritual traditions and early Hinduism. Certainly, Buddhism will continue to teach nonviolence in a variety of capacities. It is perhaps, however, with Jainism, the tradition that we see as scholars kind of beginning with the historical figure Mahavira at this time in history, that perhaps shows us the possibility of going to even greater lengths to avoid violence toward other living beings. For example, there are some within Jainism, some monks within a certain branch of Jainism that will avoid, for example, boiling water in order to cook rice, because boiling the water will kill these microscopic living beings, the bacteria that might exist in the water. Therefore, they have to depend on being given food by others because they themselves cannot perform some of the cooking activities that would result in the killing of living beings, beings with souls. They will also, sometimes you can see pictures of these Jain monks walking with these brooms, and they will be sweeping constantly in front of them as they walk in order to make sure that they sweep aside any insects that might be on their path so that they do not kill or harm those insects. So that's a little bit more of an extreme view of this nonviolent emphasis of the Ganges spiritual leaders, but we will see it definitely continue within the teachings of our Buddha as well. And then third, generally what we find in these Ganges spiritual leaders is a focus on individual responsibility rather than a reliance on deities. Right? Now, there still may have been an occasional petitioning to the deities for very practical, this worldly blessings, but especially when it comes to any kind of spiritual progress, the idea is that this isn't something that the gods and goddesses do for us. No, we have to do it on our own. The responsibility lies within us. And even when it comes to how our lives unfold, more often than not, the focus was on our own actions and thoughts and behaviors and how they contributed to the rest of our lives. So there's a much stronger focus on individual responsibility that we will see, especially in early Buddhism, taking us directly from the Buddha through the first generations and centuries of the Sangha. And yet after that, we will start to see a bit of a shift where individuals who at least look somewhat like deities will start to have a larger role when it comes to our spiritual progress. But early on, with the teaching of our Buddha and other Ganges spiritual leaders, there was a strong focus on individual responsibility rather than on a reliance on deities, especially when it comes to our spiritual journey.